The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $90, and the biggest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole county. Walt Brandhorst did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at the thing he had bought, a massive oak and iron church strongchest, long as a man is tall and waist high. A great lidded box of age-blackened oak, crossed and bound with wide bands of hand-forged iron, the corners gone soft with rot, and the whole front rusted shut behind a huge old box lock and a heavy forged hasp, so that there was no opening it, no key, no give, nothing but a ton of locked-up wood and iron 2 strong men could not carry to the truck. A rotten church chest, worth nothing, that a crowbar would only splinter, that 40 grown people had walked past all morning, and that Walt Brandhorst had just paid $90 to own. It was a cool, bright Saturday morning, the 7th of October, 1972, at the salvage auction on the old fairgrounds lot at the edge of Stillwater Run in Harrow County, Ohio. Walt was 70 years old, lean and straight through the back from a lifetime of close and careful work, just beginning to stoop, with a deeply lined face burned brown by the weather, short white hair under a flat tweed cap, and pale, steady eyes that did not move fast. His hands were broad and thick at the knuckle, a man's hands that had both set a hairline dovetail and hung a heavy church door. Walt Brandhorst had built and mended fine wood for 50 years, and kept up the old parish church on the hill the whole time beside the trade, the man they called, when a pew cracked, or a beam sagged, or the great front doors stuck in the damp. It was the kind of lot that comes after a place is torn down. The old Bethel church out on the run had stood empty a long while. The congregation dwindled and gone, and that fall the diocese had ordered the building pulled down and the salvage sold off to settle what the upkeep had run to. So they had hauled the leavings out to the fairgrounds and laid them in rows on the gravel under the open sky, the dark oak pews and the worn altar rail and the leaded window frames and the bundled timber. And the strongest, dragged up out of the vestry where it had sat against the stone wall longer than anyone living could remember, sat down at the end of the last row in the bright morning, looking like the most hopeless thing on the place. The man who laughed was Dale Furman, who ran the biggest scrap and salvage outfit between the river and the county line. A heavy-set man of 52 in a loud red check shirt and a wide pale cap, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a silver buckle the size of a saucer at his belt. $90, Dale said loud, so the people along the rope could hear it. $90 for a rotten box you'd need 4 men to lift and a crowbar to ruin. Old-timer, that lock rusted shut before either of us was born. You can't open it, can't sell it, can't even get it on a wagon. You just bought the heaviest tombstone in Harrow County, made of worm-eaten oak. He coined the name right there, and it stuck to Walt for the rest of that October. The coffin. The people laughed because Dale laughed, the way a crowd does. Walt stood through it without a change in his face, one broad hand resting flat on the cold iron band across the lid, and let the laughter wash over him and pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it was stuck and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Walt's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Walt said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What none of them knew, what Dale Furman could not have known, grinning in his good cap, was that Walt had walked the rows an hour before the sale and stopped dead at that chest, and his whole trade had risen up in him at the sight of it. The crowd saw a ruined box. Walt saw the work. He had laid his hand flat on the oak and read it the way a joiner reads another man's joinery, and the chest was not the rough plank thing a parish knocks together for kindling and cast-offs. It was built of quarter-sawn oak gone hard as iron with age, the boards rabbeted and pinned, the iron bands forged and clenched through by a smith who meant them to hold 100 years. Nobody bands a junk box in that much iron. You band the one box that has to keep. Walt would have it open before the night was out, and what he found behind that rusted lock would change how the whole county remembered a dead man and a dead church both. Walt had come up hard. He was born in 1902 and went to work at 14 in a furniture works, learning to read grain and swing a plane before he learned much else. An old German cabinetmaker took him on as a young man for his patient hands, and across the years he made himself into a joiner of the rare kind, the man a courthouse or a church called when a thing had to be mended that could not be replaced, who could let new oak into a 200-year-old door so clean you could not find the seam. But he never put down the rough trade either. He knew, as few men alive did, exactly how oak and iron and a good lock went together to keep a thing safe through long years. His wife Ada had died after a long illness, and they had laid a grown son in the ground from the war before that, and after Ada was gone, Walt lived alone at the edge of town, with his tools and his quiet and his church on the hill. The county had a use for his hands and no use at all for his opinion. He knew that. He bought the chest anyway. He bought it because he could read it. To a man who had kept up an old church for 50 years, that iron-bound box told a story the crowd could not hear. Walt knew what a parish strongchest was for, that in the old days, before there was a bank a country congregation would trust, a church kept its money and deeds and records in one heavy-locked chest in the vestry. The poor box and the building fund and the deed to the very ground all sealed behind one forged lock the minister and sexton held keys to. A chest like that did not get filled with junk. It got filled with everything a parish could not afford to lose. And the lock had never been forced. Walt had run his thumb over the iron and felt no pry mark, no break, which meant whatever the last careful hand had locked in there was locked in there still. He could not yet have told you what. But a man does not stay 50 years in a trade by ignoring what his own hands are telling him plain. If you've made it this far into Walt's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the pews and the altar rail and the leaded frames, and he waited. When the auctioneer finally got to the chest and asked $5 to start it, the crowd laughed. Dale called out his joke about the coffin, and not one other hand went up. Walt raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 90. It took both auction helpers and a chain hoist rigged off the bed of a truck to swing the better part of a ton of oak and iron up onto a borrowed flatbed, and Walt drove the 9 miles home at 20 miles an hour, the flatbed riding hard on its springs behind him, and he did not hurry. There is a kind of patience that looks like slowness right up until the moment it doesn't. And Walt Brandhorst had a whole lifetime of it riding in the cab with him. The story got around Harrow County before Walt's flatbed was off the Fairgrounds Road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, how the coffin was treating him. Merle Apgar, who ran the grain elevator, said it plainer than the rest, that there was nothing in a church chest but moldy hymnals and mouse nests. And Walt had paid $90 to haul home a box he could not even open. Walt was buying a tin of penetrating oil and a cold chisel and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that a thing is either built true or it isn't, and that the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Walt did not break it open the night he brought it home. For the better part of a week the chest sat on a low cart against the wall of his back shop, and every evening after supper he gave it an hour, learning the thing before he laid a tool to it, cleaning the vestry dust and old wax off the oak and iron, studying the lock and the bands under a strong lamp, tapping, sounding, while down at the diner they laughed and asked if he'd gotten his coffin to give up its dead yet. The Bethel Church had stood on the run the better part of 100 years, and the township had let it go with a short notice in the paper and a long opinion. The opinion was that the last sexton, an old man named Asa Krull, had run the place into the ground at the end. The caretaker, who had stayed on alone after the minister, moved away, and the congregation thinned, who they said had let the building fund dwindle to nothing through neglect or worse, grown strange and close in his last years, turned callers off the church step, and died with the parish broke and the doors finally shut for good. The talk was that he had soured so hard his grown daughter Ruth, married out and moved off, rarely came, and that he had died alone in the empty parsonage with nothing to show for 40 years of keeping the place. Walt had known Asa a little, as one quiet workman knows another, and had once been up to that vestry to ease a swollen door and seen the Strongchest there against the stone, dark and locked and silent. Walt had never thought Asa a failure. He had thought him a man carrying a weight he would not set down in front of anybody. What none of the rest of them ever asked was what an honest old sexton might do with a building fund when the congregation was scattering and there was no bank or board left he could trust to keep it whole. The answer had been standing locked in that vestry the whole time, banded in iron, too heavy to steal and too plain to wonder at. When he had studied it long enough, the sixth evening, the lamp set so the light fell square across the lock, Walt pulled up a stool and sat down in front of the chest the way another man might sit down across from somebody he had a long talk waiting with. He had sounded every inch of it by then. The boards rang dead and solid, oak through and through, no rot but at the outer corners. But the lid, when he pressed on it and worked it gently, gave the smallest true movement. The lid was sound, the hinges sound, and the only thing holding the whole chest shut was the one great forged lock and the hasp it gripped. Both seized solid with 60 years of rust, and it had never been forced. The iron ran unbroken and unmarked, which meant somebody had closed that lid, turned that lock, and let the rust seal it so that no one would ever trouble to open it again. Something in his chest went very quiet and very sure. A man does not lock a chest this careful and leave the key turned to keep nothing behind it. He went at the hasp first, slow, with the respect one craftsman gives the hand that built another's work. He worked penetrating oil into the lock and the band bolts 3 evenings running until the rust began to let go its grip a grain at a time. Then he set a thin pry behind the great hasp staple, not to break the oak, but to ease the clenched iron. And the old smith work came free of the wood reluctant and whole. The cold lived in his old knuckles like weather, but his hands did not shake, because a man who has done close and careful work 10,000 times does it long after the rest of him has gotten old. He drew the band bolts one by one, backing each rusted clench nail with a wider chisel, and worked the seized lock with a fine pick and a feeler, the way the old German had taught him to coax, a stubborn ward, patient, listening, until a little before 11 the worn bolt drew back under his fingers with a small, sure grind he felt more than heard. Walt set both broad hands flat under the front lip of the lid, and the great oak top of a chest the whole county had buried as a rotten coffin rose on its hinges at last, slow and heavy, into the lamplight. The chamber was deep and dry and dark, lined in old cedar against the damp, and it was not empty. Packed careful and square inside, wrapped against the ears, was everything a faithful man had locked away from the worst time of a dying parish, sitting whole where no creditor and no thief and no closing down would ever reach it. Walt sat with his hand on the open lid and looked into the bottom of a $90 chest the township had laughed at as a coffin. He took the things out one at a time and laid them on the bench under the lamp. Slow, handling each like something another man had trusted to the dark for years. There were 3 kinds of things sealed in that chest. The first was the money, not flung in loose, but a careful man's whole keeping, wrapped against the damp in oilcloth, the building fund, banded bills of the old large-size kind, a great many of them, and beneath them a heavy cloth roll that clinked when he lifted it. Gold coin, double eagles and half eagles set aside one at a time across whatever good years there were, and under that a paper tube of silver worn smooth. Walt was no appraiser, but he had handled enough hard money to know he was looking at far more than the whole Bethel salvage had brought that morning. And the gold alone, in 1972, was worth a great deal past the face stamped on it. The second thing was the papers, sealed flat in a stiff oilcloth folder. The clear deed to the church ground and the little burying yard beside it, free of any lien. A sheaf of government savings bonds bought for the building fund and never cashed. And a thick hand-kept ledger, the pages ruled and filled in a small square hand, the parish book. Every offering and every poor box gift and every dollar of the building fund set down honest against the date. A record that did not show a fund run into the ground at all, but one carried whole and growing through the lean years by one stubborn hand. Folded in with the ledger, in that same square hand, was a single sheet headed for Ruth and the rest. Walt set that sheet aside unread for the moment, because it felt like a thing a stranger ought to come to last. The third thing was the letter, one folded page, sealed in its own envelope and set upright at the front of the chamber, where a man would see it first when the lid came up, and on the outside, in that same hard square hand, it said only, "To whoever opens this, if my Ruth cannot." Walt worked the envelope open and read what a dead man had written for whoever reached it. Asa Krull wrote that he had stayed on as sexton after the minister left and the people scattered, the last man keeping the doors of a church the world had decided was finished, and had watched the diocese make ready to close it and sell the ground out from under the dead in the little yard. The ledger, he wrote, was the true account of the building fund, which he had not spent and had not lost, but had kept and added to in secret, meaning to hold the church and its burying yard whole as long as one man's life would stretch to. The gold and the bonds were that fund, sealed in the one heavy thing in the vestry that could not be carried off, so that no closing down and no creditor of the diocese could ever empty it before its work was done. He had let the township call him a failure, he wrote, because a locked chest keeps its secret best behind a sour name. He asked, plain, that the fund keep the burying yard tended and the dead undisturbed as long as it would reach, and the rest go to his daughter Ruth, who he had been too proud and too ashamed to tell while he lived. Below his name he had written it out, "Tell her I never let the place down." I kept the fund whole so the church's word to the dead would still mean something even after the doors were shut. Walt read it twice through, and the only man in Harrow County who had ever thought Asa Krull was carrying something now held the proof of it in two hands. Walt did the only thing a man like Walt would do. The next morning he went to the county and asked who had handled the Bethel matter, and over the better part of a month they traced Ruth to a town 2 states off and put into a lawyer's hands what had come out of a $90 chest, every coin and bond and the parish ledger entire. Walt did not keep a cent of it, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. A thing asked for plain ought to be honored. Ruth Krull Vance came to Stillwater Run on a gray morning that November, a careworn woman of about 46, her brown hair going gray, and when the lawyer laid her father's letter and the parish ledger on the table and she read them through, she put one hand flat over her mouth and her eyes filled, and she did not say anything for a long time. She had buried her father, believing the township story, and worse, her own, that he had let the church and himself fall to nothing and shut her out for it, and the letter told her instead that the failure had been a face he wore on purpose, to keep whole a thing he had given his life to guard. She asked to meet the man who had opened it, and Walt came to the lawyer's door in his shirt sleeves and stood there plain while she thanked him with her voice shaking, and all he said was that her father had locked it the way a man locks a thing he means to last, and that things locked that careful generally do. That winter, with the gold and the bonds behind it, the little Bethel burying yard was put under a standing keeping, so the dead would lie undisturbed and the ground stay tended, and not one person in the township ever again called Asa Krull a man who had let the place down. Word of it went around Harrow County the same way the laughter had, only quieter. And the people who had called Walt a fool let the name coffin drop and did not pick it up again. Dale Furman was not run out of the county and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he did not understand, and the next time he held court at the diner counter, the others did not lean in so far. Walt never said a word against him. Being right was the whole of what he had wanted, and being right had brought a decent dead man's name back up out of the dirt, which is more than it usually does. Ruth kept the chest. She would not have it scrapped or broken up. She had Walt mend the rotted corners with new oak let in clean and rehang the great lock as her father had left it. And she set it at the foot of her own bed and told her grown family, who would carry it after her, that the outside was what the hard years had made of her father, and the inside was what he had been the whole time underneath. And on a still evening that next summer, the light going gold across the open country, Walt Brandhorst drove out to look in on her, and Ruth brought him inside, and there at the foot of the bed in the last of the sun stood the oak and iron Strongchest, whole and sound and locked again. Walt was 70 years old, a man the township had laughed at one whole October, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad, careful hand flat on the cool iron band and then nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A man locks the strongest shut so the good will keep for the ones who come after, even when he cannot say so himself, and the world rarely knows what was carried through the hard years until somebody troubles to open what no one else would. So I'll leave it to you. Was Walt Brandhorst right to hand back every dollar of it without keeping a cent for himself? Or was that one decency too far, in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.